Before there were blueprints rolled in leather tubes, before there were city planners with their measuring tools gleaming in office windows, there was Keshen. His hands were the color of river clay, and his eyes held the patient wisdom of someone who had spent 30 years watching cities grow from nothing more than careful lines drawn in wet earth. In the valley where two great rivers embraced the land with their gentle floods, where the soil was rich as honey and the horizon stretched endlessly under a dome of pearl blue sky, Keshen would wake each morning before the sun touched the walls of Harappa. He would rise from his simple sleeping mat, step carefully around his sleeping family, and make his way through streets so perfectly planned that even in darkness, his feet knew exactly where to fall. This is not a story of kings or wars, of great discoveries or dramatic change. This is the story of something far more profound and infinitely more peaceful, the slow, methodical creation of perfection. It is the story of minds that thought not in years, but in generations. Hands that laid brick upon brick with the patience of stars moving across the sky. Hearts that found deep satisfaction in the simple knowledge that water would flow where it should flow, that streets would meet at precisely the right angles, that every family would have space for their grain and their children and their quiet evening conversations. The Indus Valley civilization flourished for nearly 1,000 years, from roughly 2600 to 1900 BCE, across what is now Pakistan and northwest India. They built cities that would make modern urban planners weep with admiration. Perfect grids of streets, sophisticated drainage systems, standardized weights and measures, houses with private wells and bathrooms, public baths that could have been temples to cleanliness itself. But this story isn't about the civilization's achievements recorded in archaeologists' careful notes. This is about Keshen, and others like him, whose names we will never know but whose work still whispers to us from beneath 4,000 years of accumulated earth. This is about the profound peace that comes from doing one thing, quietly and well, for an entire lifetime. As we settle into this long night's journey through time, let your breathing slow to match the rhythm of ancient footsteps. Let your mind quiet to the level of concentration needed to plan a city that will shelter families for centuries. Feel the weight of responsibility that comes not from ruling, but from serving. From knowing that the work of your hands will determine whether children have clean water to drink, whether grandmothers have smooth paths to walk, whether the rains of the monsoon will flow away safely instead of pooling in stagnant, disease-breeding ponds. Close your eyes now, and step with me into a world where perfection was not a moment's achievement, but a way of life. The land and its rhythms. In the time before time had names, when the world was younger and the rivers ran fuller, there was a valley. Not just any valley, but one carved by the patient hands of two great rivers, the Indus and the Sarasvati, flowing down from mountains so distant they seemed like clouds against the northern sky. These rivers brought life in their bellies, rich, dark silt that spread across the plains each year like a gentle blessing, transforming the landscape into something that could only be called abundant. The monsoons came with their own ancient rhythm, arriving each summer with the reliability of breath itself. For months, the sky would build its towers of cloud, great castles of vapor that climbed so high they seemed to touch the ceiling of the world. Then, when the earth had grown hot and dusty with waiting, the rains would begin. Not the violent storms of other lands, but steady, soaking rains that fell with the patience of eternity. Keshen had been born into this rhythm, as had his father, and his father's father, stretching back through generations whose names had become part of the earth itself. He understood, with the deep knowledge that lives in bones rather than thoughts, that everything here moved in cycles. The rivers rose and fell. The rains came and went. The earth opened to receive seeds and closed to protect them. And in harmony with these great movements, human beings had learned to build something unprecedented in the history of the world, cities that worked. The morning air in Harappa carried scents that told stories, the sweet earthiness of sun-dried bricks curing in neat rows, the green smell of wheat and barley growing in fields that stretched beyond sight, the faint mineral tang of clean water flowing through covered drains. Even the dust here seemed organized, settling in predictable patterns that could be swept away each morning with reed brooms worn smooth by countless hands. Keshen's workshop sat at the intersection of two major streets, positioned there not by accident, but by the careful planning of men who had lived 3 generations before him. From his doorway, he could see the geometric perfection of the city stretching in all directions, straight, lines that met at perfect right angles, creating blocks so uniform that a visitor from the modern world would think immediately of graph paper made manifest in brick and mortar. But there was nothing cold about this perfection. The standardized brick sizes, each one exactly 4:2:1 in ratio, fired to a hardness that would outlast empires, created walls that glowed warm and golden in the morning light. The uniform street widths allowed breezes to flow freely, carrying away the heat of summer days and the moisture of monsoon nights. The covered drains that ran beneath every street created a hidden network of flowing water that kept the city clean without anyone having to think about it. This was planning elevated to the level of art, but art so subtle that it felt like nature itself. Keshen's world. Keshen was what we might call an urban planner, though the people of Harappa had no such words. He was simply one of the men who thought about how cities should grow, how water should flow, how people should move through space in ways that brought them peace rather than friction. His father had taught him to see the invisible patterns that governed human movement, how a street that was too narrow would fill with quarrels, how a drain that sloped incorrectly would bring disease, how a marketplace placed wrongly would create chaos where there should be calm. The workshop where Keshen spent his days was a marvel of organized simplicity. Clay tablets lined the walls, each one marked with careful symbols that recorded the dimensions of buildings, the angles of streets, the depths of wells. Measuring rods of ivory and bronze hung from wooden pegs, each one calibrated against the master standards that were kept in the great bath at the city's heart. Reed pens and metal styluses lay arranged in precise rows, alongside pots of different colored clays for marking different types of structures on his planning tablets. But the most important tool in Keshen's workshop was something that couldn't be touched, the accumulated wisdom of generations of city builders. This knowledge lived not in any written form, but in the steady rhythm of his work, the automatic precision of his measurements, the intuitive understanding of how space and human behavior interacted. It was knowledge that had been passed down through apprenticeships that lasted decades, through conversations carried on while laying foundations, through the silent observation of what worked and what didn't work in the daily life of the city. Every morning, Keshen would begin his day by walking the city, not hurrying, but moving with the deliberate pace of someone who sees everything. He would notice where water had pooled after the night's rain, indicating a drain that needed attention. He would observe how people naturally moved through the intersections, noting whether the widths of connecting streets created smooth flow or awkward congestion. He would listen to the sounds of the city waking up, the grinding of grain in mortars, the splash of water being drawn from wells, the soft conversations of families beginning their day. These walks were not inspections in any formal sense. They were more like meditation, a daily practice of attention that kept Keshen's mind attuned to the subtle ways that physical space influenced human happiness. He had learned, over 30 years of this work, that cities were not collections of buildings but living systems, as complex and interconnected as the human body itself. The people of Harappa understood this intuitively. They kept their houses and streets clean not because of laws or regulations, but because cleanliness was woven into the very structure of their world. Each house had its own well, ensuring that clean water was always available. Each house had its own bathroom, with carefully engineered drainage that carried waste away through covered channels. Each neighborhood had its own public areas where people could gather, talk, and watch their children play. Privacy and community existed in perfect balance. The walls of houses were thick enough to keep family conversations family matters, but courtyards were designed to catch and share the sounds of daily life, laughter, music, the rhythmic sounds of work being done with satisfaction. Windows were placed to allow breezes to flow through houses, but positioned to preserve modesty and intimacy. The art of perfection. In Keshen's time, the making of bricks was not merely construction but something approaching ceremony. The brickmakers worked in groups of families, with knowledge passed from parents to children in an unbroken chain that stretched back to the first settlements in the valley. They knew, with a precision that would astonish modern engineers, exactly how to mix clay and organic matter to create bricks that would last for millennia. The clay came from specific areas along the riverbanks, where generations of flooding had deposited layers of sediment with just the right consistency. The brickmakers would arrive at these sites before dawn, when the clay was still cool and damp from the night air. They worked with their hands and simple tools, feeling for the texture that meant the clay was ready. Too much sand, and the bricks would crumble. Too little, and they would crack as they dried. But the real magic happened in the kilns. These were not simple fire pits but carefully engineered structures that could maintain precise temperatures for days at a time. The master brickmakers understood the relationship between heat, time, and clay composition with an intuitive knowledge that had been refined over centuries. They knew which woods burned hottest, how to arrange the unfired bricks to ensure even heating, how to read the color of the flames to know when the temperature was exactly right. Each brick, when finished, was virtually identical to every other brick. Not because of machines or molds, but because generations of craftsmen had learned to see and feel the subtle differences that meant perfection. The ratio of length to width to height never varied, 4:2:1, as precise as a mathematical constant. This standardization meant that buildings could be planned on paper, or rather, on clay tablets, with absolute confidence that the reality would match the design. Keshen would visit the brick kilns regularly, not to inspect or criticize, but to maintain the relationship between planning and making that kept the city growing in harmony with itself. He would sit with the master brickmakers in the evening, when the day's firing was done and the kilns glowed like small red moons in the gathering darkness. They would talk quietly about the expansion of the city, about new areas that needed to be developed, about improvements that could be made to existing neighborhoods. These conversations happened without urgency or pressure. In the Indus Valley, cities grew like trees, steadily, naturally, following patterns that had been established by wisdom rather than haste. There were no property developers pressuring for quick construction, no political deadlines forcing compromised solutions. The pace of growth was determined by the availability of good bricks, skilled workers, and carefully considered plans. When a new area of the city was to be developed, Keshen would spend months walking the site. At different times of day, in different seasons, observing how water moved across the land, how the sun fell, how the wind blew. He would imagine families living there, children playing in courtyards, women drawing water from wells, men returning from work in the fields or workshops. Only when he could see the future life of the place clearly in his mind would he begin to draw the plans on his clay tablets. The morning ritual. Each day began for Keshen in the same way it had begun for 30 years. The first light of dawn would filter through the small window of his house, and he would wake not to any external sound but to an internal rhythm as precise as the flooding of the rivers. His house, like all houses in Harappa, was designed to work with the natural patterns of light and air. The window faced east, so the morning sun would enter gently, warming the room gradually rather than flooding it with harsh brightness. He would rise slowly, appreciating the feel of the smooth brick floor beneath his feet. The floor had been laid by his grandfather's generation, each brick fitted so precisely that even after decades of use, the surface remained level and unmarked by wear. This was the kind of detail that visitors to Harappa often failed to notice at first, the way that ordinary surfaces, ordinary transitions, ordinary daily interactions had been thought through with extraordinary care. His washing water waited in a ceramic vessel that sat in a shallow basin connected to the house's drainage system. Like everything in the Indus Valley cities, this arrangement was both practical and beautiful. The water stayed cool through the night, the basin caught any spillage, and everything drained away cleanly without creating puddles or stagnation. Keshen would pour the water over his hands and face slowly, enjoying the simple pleasure of coolness and cleanliness that many civilizations would not achieve for another 1,000 years. The clothes he wore were simple but precisely made, a wraparound garment of cotton that had been grown in the nearby fields, spun by local craftspeople, and dyed with colors extracted from plants that grew wild along the riverbanks. The cotton was soft from years of wearing and washing, broken into the exact shape of his body. The dye had faded to a color that seemed to capture the essence of earth and sky mixed together. Before leaving his house, Keshen would spend a few minutes in what we might call meditation, though he would have thought of it simply as preparation. He would stand in his small courtyard, feeling the morning air, listening to the sounds of the city beginning to wake. Water flowing through the covered drains beneath the streets created a constant, barely audible murmur that served as a kind of urban heartbeat. Children's voices would begin to emerge from neighboring courtyards, soft and sleepy at first, then gradually more animated as the day took hold. The streets of Harappa in the early morning were a study in purposeful tranquility. People emerged from their houses slowly, without hurry, and moved through the grid of perfectly straight streets with the fluid ease of water finding its level. There were no crowds, no pushing, no confusion about where to go or how to get there. The city had been designed to eliminate such frictions, and 400 years of continuous habitation had refined the patterns of movement until they felt as natural as breathing. Keshen's morning walk took him along Main Street, the great north-south avenue that ran through the heart of Harappa like a spine. This street was wide enough for 2 ox carts to pass comfortably, with additional space for pedestrians. But it was never crowded because the smaller streets that branched off from it were equally well planned, distributing traffic naturally throughout the city. People went where they needed to go by the most direct route, without the detours and complications that plagued less thoughtfully designed settlements. The workshop rhythms. Keshen's workshop occupied the ground floor of a 2-story building at one of the city's major intersections. The location had been chosen by his predecessor, and before that by his predecessor's predecessor, because it offered the perfect combination of accessibility and observation. From the workshop's main window, Keshen could see the flow of people and goods through one of the city's primary transportation nodes. From the smaller side window, he could observe the residential area where many of the city's craftspeople lived and worked. The workshop itself was organized with the same methodical precision that characterized everything in Harappa. Work surfaces were arranged to take advantage of natural light throughout the day. Storage areas were positioned to be easily accessible but out of the way of daily workflow. Tools were kept in specific places, cleaned and ready for use. Clay tablets were filed according to a system that allowed any piece of information to be found quickly. But perhaps the most important feature of the workshop was its quietness. The thick brick walls and carefully planned proportions created a space where concentration came naturally. External sounds were muffled to a gentle murmur, while the internal acoustics allowed Keshen to hear the subtle sounds of his own work, the scratch of stylus on clay, the whisper of reed pen across wet tablet, the soft thud of measuring rods being set down on wooden surfaces. Keshen's first task each morning was to review the work from the previous day. This meant not just looking at the plans and calculations he had made, but thinking through them again, checking them against his accumulated understanding of how the city worked. He had learned, over the years, that the best plans were not those that looked perfect on the tablet, but those that would create spaces where people could live with dignity and joy. The clay tablets that covered his work tables were covered with symbols that recorded a lifetime of careful observation. Measurements of street widths, angles of drainage slopes, depths of foundation trenches, heights of walls. But interspersed with these technical notations were what modern planners might call sociological observations, notes about where people tended to gather, which routes they preferred to take, how different arrangements of space affected the patterns of daily life. For instance, Keshen had noticed that courtyards shaped as perfect squares tended to feel formal and uninviting, while those with slight rectangular proportions encouraged more relaxed social interaction. He had observed that wells placed exactly in the center of neighborhood spaces became focal points for community life, while those positioned slightly to one side allowed for both public and private access to water. He had learned that streets that ran perfectly straight for long distances made people walk faster and interact less, while streets with gentle curves and carefully planned sightlines encouraged a more leisurely pace. These were discoveries that could only be made through years of patient observation, and they represented a kind of knowledge that was never written down in any formal way. Instead, it lived in the accumulated wisdom of the planning community, passed down through apprenticeships and reinforced through daily practice. The Great Bath. Once each week, Keshen would make a special journey to the Great Bath, the magnificent public building that stood at the spiritual and administrative heart of Harappa. This was not a casual visit but something approaching pilgrimage, a time for him to reconnect with the deepest principles of his work. The Great Bath was a marvel of engineering and architecture that would not be equaled anywhere in the world for another 1,000 years. The main pool was nearly 40 feet long and 25 feet wide, lined with carefully fitted bricks and sealed with a layer of bitumen that made it completely watertight. But it was not just the technical achievement that made the structure remarkable, it was the way it embodied the Indus Valley understanding of the relationship between cleanliness, community, and spiritual well-being. The approach to the Great Bath was designed to create a sense of gradual transition from the everyday world to a space of greater meaning. Visitors would enter through a series of smaller rooms, each one serving a specific purpose in the process of preparation. There were changing rooms with built-in niches for storing clothes and personal items. There were smaller pools for preliminary washing. There were areas for quiet conversation and areas for solitary reflection. Keshen would arrive at the Great Bath in the early afternoon, when the sunlight streaming through the carefully positioned windows created patterns of light and shadow that seemed to make the water glow from within. He would move through the preparatory spaces slowly, appreciating the way that each room led naturally to the next, the way that the architecture itself encouraged a gradual shift in consciousness from the practical concerns of daily work to something more expansive and contemplative. The main pool was filled with water that was constantly refreshed through an ingenious system of channels and drains. The water entered through covered conduits that protected it from contamination, and exited through equally sophisticated drainage that carried it away to irrigate the gardens that surrounded the building. The temperature of the water was regulated by the thermal mass of the surrounding brick structure, which absorbed heat during the day and released it slowly at night. When Keshen lowered himself into the pool, the water would be exactly the right temperature. Warm enough to be soothing, cool enough to be invigorating. He would move slowly through the water, feeling the accumulated tension of the week's work dissolve from his muscles. But this was not mere physical relaxation, it was a kind of mental and spiritual cleansing that allowed him to approach his work with renewed clarity and purpose. Other members of the planning community would often be at the Great Bath at the same time, and they would engage in the kind of quiet, thoughtful conversation that was impossible in the midst of daily work pressures. They would discuss challenges they were facing, innovations they were considering, observations they had made about how the city was evolving. But these conversations happened without urgency or competition. Everyone understood that the work they were doing was larger than any individual ambition, part of a collective effort that stretched across generations. The Great Bath also served as a kind of informal university for the study of urban planning. Young apprentices would come to observe and learn, watching how the experienced planners moved through the space, listening to their conversations, absorbing the subtle principles that governed their work. This was education not through formal instruction but through immersion in a community of practice. The afternoon survey. The hottest part of each day, when the sun blazed overhead and most people sought shade, was when Keshen did his most important work, the detailed survey of the city's systems. This was when he would walk every street, inspect every drain, observe every intersection, checking for problems that needed attention and opportunities for improvement. He would begin these surveys in the residential areas, moving slowly through the grid of streets and alleys that housed the majority of Harappa's population. Each house was a small marvel of design, with its own well, its own bathroom, its own drainage system. But what made the residential areas truly remarkable was the way individual houses worked together as a coordinated system. The drainage, for instance, was not simply a matter of individual houses disposing of their waste water. Instead, it was a carefully engineered network that collected water from private houses, channeled it through covered drains that ran beneath the streets, and ultimately directed it to areas where it could be used for irrigation. The system was designed with enough redundancy that blockages in one area wouldn't cause problems elsewhere, and with enough capacity that even the heaviest monsoon rains would flow away cleanly. Keshen would follow these drainage channels on foot, noting where sediment was beginning to accumulate, where tree roots were starting to interfere with flow, where repairs might be needed. But this was not merely maintenance work, it was a form of continuous design refinement. Each problem he identified was also an opportunity to improve the system, to make it work even better for the people who depended on it. The commercial areas of the city required a different kind of attention. Here, the streets were wider to accommodate the movement of goods, and the buildings were larger to house workshops and storage areas. The drainage system had to handle not just household waste water but the runoff from industrial processes, the dyeing of textiles, the firing of pottery, the smelting of metals. Keshen had developed, over the years, an almost supernatural ability to diagnose problems before they became serious. He could tell from the sound of water flowing through a drain whether it was running at the proper capacity. He could identify from subtle changes in the color or texture of street surfaces whether underground systems were functioning correctly. He could predict from the patterns of wear on paving stones whether traffic flow was creating problems that would need to be addressed. But perhaps most remarkably, he could sense when social problems were beginning to manifest themselves in physical space. Neighborhoods where people were becoming isolated from each other would show subtle signs: less wear on the paths between houses, less evidence of shared activities in common areas, less care in the maintenance of semi-public spaces. Areas where population density was becoming too high would reveal themselves through increased wear patterns, more frequent drainage problems, subtle changes in the acoustic environment. These observations allowed Keshen and his colleagues to intervene before problems became serious. A neighborhood that was becoming too isolated might benefit from the creation of a new public space or the rerouting of a pathway to encourage more interaction. An area that was becoming overcrowded might need new housing development or the creation of satellite commercial areas to reduce pressure on existing facilities. The evening consultations. As the sun began to set and the heat of the day gave way to the gentle coolness of evening, Keshen would return to his workshop for what was perhaps the most satisfying part of his daily routine: consultations with individual families and craftspeople who were planning new construction or modifications to existing buildings. These consultations were not formal appointments but informal conversations that happened naturally as part of the city's social rhythm. People would stop by the workshop when they had questions or when they wanted to discuss their building plans. Keshen would listen carefully to what they needed, ask questions about how they lived and worked, and then offer suggestions that would help them achieve their goals in harmony with the city's overall design principles. A potter, for instance, might want to expand his workshop to accommodate a new kiln. Keshen would visit the site, observe how the potter worked, understand the requirements of the pottery making process, and then suggest ways to expand the workshop that would improve working conditions while maintaining proper drainage and ventilation. The goal was not just to solve the immediate problem but to create a solution that would work well for decades to come. A young couple planning to start a family might want to modify their house to include additional rooms. Keshen would spend time with them, understanding their vision for their family life, their work requirements, their relationships with neighbors. Then he would suggest modifications that would give them the space they needed while preserving the privacy and community connections that made neighborhood life pleasant. These consultations required not just technical knowledge but a deep understanding of human nature and social dynamics. Keshen had to be able to listen beneath the surface of what people said they wanted to understand what they actually needed. He had to balance individual desires with community needs. He had to think not just about immediate requirements but about how people's needs might change over time. The conversations that happened during these evening consultations were among the most rewarding aspects of Keshen's work. They connected him directly to the human impact of his planning decisions. They reminded him that the ultimate purpose of all the technical sophistication, all the careful measurements and precise calculations, was to create spaces where people could live with dignity and joy. Sometimes these consultations would extend late into the evening, with neighbors joining the conversation, sharing their own experiences and insights. The workshop would fill with the soft murmur of voices, the gentle light of oil lamps, the sense of community that came from people working together to solve practical problems. These were moments when the distinction between expert and amateur, between planner and resident, would blur into something more collaborative and organic. The seasonal rhythms. The work of city planning in the Indus Valley was intimately connected to the rhythm of the seasons, and Keshen's activities throughout the year followed patterns that had been established by generations of experience with the climate and the land. The dry season, which lasted from October through March, was the time for major construction projects. The rivers were at their lowest levels, making it easier to work on infrastructure projects that involved diverting or channeling water. The absence of rain meant that brickmaking could proceed at maximum capacity, with kilns firing continuously and new bricks curing under the reliable sunshine. Foundation work could be done without worry about flooding or unstable ground conditions. During these months, Keshen would spend much of his time on construction sites, working with builders and craftspeople to ensure that new construction followed the established planning principles. He would be involved in every stage of the process, from the initial layout of foundation trenches to the final installation of drainage systems. This hands-on involvement was essential for maintaining the quality and consistency that made Harappa function so smoothly. The hot season, from April through June, was a time for detailed planning and design work. The extreme heat made heavy construction impractical, but it was perfect for the kind of concentrated mental work that went into developing comprehensive plans for new areas of the city. Keshen would spend these months in his workshop, working with clay tablets and measuring instruments to design the expansions and improvements that would be built when the weather became more favorable. But even during the hot season, essential maintenance work continued. The drainage systems had to be inspected and cleaned before the monsoon rains arrived. Wells had to be checked to ensure they would provide adequate water during the driest months. Public buildings had to be prepared for the intense heat and the sudden transition to heavy rains that the monsoon would bring. The monsoon season, from July through September, was perhaps the most critical time for urban planning in the Indus Valley. This was when all the careful engineering of the drainage systems would be put to the test. The city had to be able to handle vast quantities of water quickly and efficiently, channeling the rain away from residential areas while capturing enough for storage and irrigation. Keshen would spend the monsoon months monitoring the performance of the city's water management systems. He would walk the streets during heavy rains, observing how water flowed, identifying any areas where improvements were needed. The monsoon was also a time for observing how people used the city during the rainy season, noting any changes in traffic patterns or social activities that might suggest modifications to the urban design. But the monsoon was also a time of great beauty and satisfaction. The rains would wash the dust from the streets and buildings, revealing the full glory of the city's architecture. The carefully planned gardens and courtyards would bloom with flowers and green vegetation. The sound of water flowing through the drainage systems would become a constant, soothing background music that reminded everyone of the sophisticated infrastructure that made their comfortable lives possible. The transition from monsoon to dry season was always a time of assessment and planning for the coming year. Keshen would compile his observations from the rainy months, identifying projects that needed to be undertaken, improvements that could be made, innovations that might be worth trying. These assessments formed the basis for the planning work that would occupy the hot season and the construction projects that would fill the following dry season. The legacy of generations. As Keshen entered the final years of his career, he began to spend more time thinking about the nature of the work he had devoted his life to. The city of Harappa had been thriving for over 300 years when he was born, and it showed no signs of decline. The systems he had helped to maintain and improve were functioning as smoothly as ever. The population was stable and prosperous. The physical infrastructure was in excellent condition. This continuity was perhaps the greatest achievement of Indus Valley civilization, the creation of urban systems that could function successfully over periods of time that dwarfed the lifespan of any individual. The city had survived droughts and floods, changes in trade routes and political structures, the gradual evolution of technology and social customs. Through all these changes, the fundamental principles of urban organization had remained constant. What made this stability possible, Keshen understood, was not any single brilliant innovation but rather the systematic application of accumulated wisdom. Each generation of planners had built upon the work of their predecessors, making incremental improvements while preserving the essential features that made the system work. The result was a form of urban organization that was both highly sophisticated and deeply resilient. The apprentices who now worked in Keshen's workshop represented the next link in this chain of knowledge transmission. They had spent years learning not just the technical aspects of urban planning but the deeper principles that guided all decision-making, the importance of thinking in terms of generations rather than years, the need to balance individual needs with community requirements, the value of working with natural systems rather than against them. These young men would face challenges that Keshen could not fully anticipate. The climate was beginning to change in subtle ways, with the monsoons becoming less reliable and the rivers showing signs of instability. Trade networks that had been stable for centuries were shifting as new civilizations emerged in distant lands. The population of the city was growing slowly but steadily, putting new pressures on existing infrastructure. But Keshen was confident that the principles he had learned and taught would serve future generations well. the emphasis on careful observation, systematic thinking, and gradual improvement had proven effective for hundreds of years. The tradition of collaborative decision-making, where major changes were discussed extensively before being implemented, ensured that innovations would be tested carefully before being adopted widely. Most importantly, the deep connection between urban planning and human well-being that characterized Indus Valley civilization would continue to guide future development. The cities had not been built primarily for commercial or political purposes, but to create spaces where families could thrive, where children could grow up safely, where elders could live with dignity, where everyone could have access to clean water, adequate shelter, and meaningful work. The rhythm of endings. In his final years of active practice, Keshen developed a ritual that brought him great satisfaction and peace. Each evening, after the day's work was done and the last consultations were finished, he would climb to the roof of his workshop and spend time looking out over the city he had helped to shape. From this vantage point, he could see the geometric perfection of the street grid stretching away in all directions. He could observe the gentle flow of people moving through the urban landscape, following patterns that had been established by generations of careful planning. He could listen to the sounds of a city at peace with itself, children playing in courtyards, families sharing evening meals, craftspeople finishing their daily work. The view from the rooftop also allowed Keshen to appreciate the relationship between the human-built environment and the natural landscape that surrounded it. The city existed in harmony with the river valley, neither dominating the natural systems nor being dominated by them. The urban areas were clearly defined, with agricultural fields beginning just beyond the last row of houses. The relationship between city and countryside was one of mutual support, rather than competition. As the seasons cycled through their ancient rhythm, Keshen found himself paying more attention to the subtle changes that marked the passage of time. The way the light fell across the city at different times of year, the patterns of bird migration that followed the rivers, the gradual changes in the vegetation that surrounded the urban areas. These observations reminded him that human civilization, no matter how sophisticated, remained part of larger natural systems that operated on scales far beyond individual human experience. The knowledge that his work was part of something larger than himself brought Keshen a deep sense of satisfaction. He had not worked for personal glory or individual achievement, but as part of a collective effort that stretched across generations. The drainage systems he had helped to design would serve families for centuries after his death. The planning principles he had helped to refine would guide urban development long after his name was forgotten. This sense of participating in something enduring gave meaning to the daily routine of measurement and calculation, observation and planning that had filled his professional life. Each small decision, each minor improvement, each careful revision to established practice was a contribution to a larger project of creating human settlements that could support flourishing communities over long periods of time. The young apprentices who worked with Keshen during these final years were struck by his apparent absence of ego or ambition. He seemed genuinely unconcerned with receiving credit for his contributions or being remembered for his innovations. His satisfaction came entirely from the knowledge that the work was being done well, that the systems were functioning properly, that people's lives were being enhanced by the quality of their physical environment. The final survey. On a morning late in his career, Keshen set out for what would be his final comprehensive survey of Harappa. He had decided that it was time to step back from active practice, to spend his remaining years as an advisor and teacher rather than a primary practitioner. But before making this transition, he wanted to walk the entire city one more time, observing everything with the accumulated wisdom of 4 decades of experience. He began before dawn, when the streets were empty and the city existed in a state of pure potential. The first light revealed the geometric perfection of the urban layout with startling clarity. The straight lines of the streets, the regular spacing of the intersections, the uniform heights of the buildings created a visual harmony that never failed to move him. This was human intelligence applied with patience and care to create something that served both practical and aesthetic purposes. As the city began to wake up around him, Keshen paid special attention to the human dimensions of the urban landscape. He watched families emerge from their houses and begin their daily routines. He observed the natural flow of people through the street network, the way That the city's design channeled movement without creating congestion or conflict. He listened to the sounds of daily life, the splash of water being drawn from wells, the rhythmic grinding of grain, the voices of children beginning their day. In the commercial areas, he noted how the wider streets and larger buildings accommodated the needs of craftspeople and traders without overwhelming the residential character of the surrounding neighborhoods. The transition from commercial to residential areas was gradual and natural, without the sharp boundaries that characterized less thoughtfully planned settlements. The drainage systems that ran beneath his feet were functioning perfectly, carrying away the previous night's wastewater and preparing for the day's new flows. These hidden networks represented perhaps the greatest achievement of Indus Valley urban planning, the creation of infrastructure that supported public health and environmental quality without requiring conscious attention from the people who benefited from it. As he walked, Keshen found himself mentally cataloging all the innovations and improvements that had been made during his career. Refinements to drainage slopes that improved flow rates, adjustments to street widths that enhanced traffic patterns, modifications to building standards that improved living conditions. Each change had been small and incremental, but together they represented a significant enhancement of the city's functionality. But what struck him most forcefully during this final survey was not the technical sophistication of the urban systems but their essential humanity. Every feature of the city had been designed with careful attention to human needs and preferences. The scale of buildings and streets was comfortable for pedestrians. The provision of private and semi-private spaces allowed for both individual reflection and community interaction. The integration of work and residential areas meant that people could live close to their livelihoods without sacrificing the quality of their home environment. By evening, when Keshen had completed his circuit of the entire city, he felt a profound sense of completion. The work that he had inherited from previous generations was in good condition. The systems were functioning well. The traditions of careful planning and gradual improvement were being maintained by capable successors. He had fulfilled his responsibility to both the past and the future. The wisdom of water. In the quiet years that followed his retirement from active practice, Keshen often returned to contemplate the Great Bath. This magnificent structure had become, for him, a symbol of everything that the Indus Valley civilization had achieved: the integration of technical sophistication with spiritual depth, the harmony between individual and community needs, the creation of beauty through the intelligent application of practical knowledge. The Great Bath represented water management elevated to the level of art. The engineering required to maintain proper water quality, temperature, and flow rates was extraordinarily complex, involving pumps, filters, drains, and channels that worked together as a seamlessly integrated system. But the technical achievement was completely invisible to the people who used the facility. They experienced only the pleasure of clean, warm water and the peace that came from being in a space designed to promote reflection and renewal. This invisibility of technical complexity was characteristic of everything in Harappa. The sophisticated urban systems worked so well that they seemed natural and effortless. People could focus on their families, their work, their spiritual development, their community relationships without having to worry about basic infrastructure needs. Clean water was always available. Waste was always disposed of properly. Streets were always passable. Buildings were always structurally sound. This achievement represented a profound understanding of the relationship between technology and human well-being. The Indus Valley planners had recognized that the purpose of technical sophistication was not to impress or intimidate, but to create conditions where human potential could flourish. They had developed complex systems not for their own sake, but as tools for enhancing the quality of daily life. Water, in particular, held deep significance in Indus Valley culture. It represented not just a practical necessity but a spiritual principle. The careful management of water resources reflected a broader understanding of the need to live in harmony with natural cycles and systems. The emphasis on cleanliness that pervaded all aspects of urban life was not merely a matter of hygiene but an expression of deeper values about purity, renewal, and respect for life itself. The ritual bathing that took place at the Great Bath was both a practical activity and a spiritual practice. People came not just to clean their bodies but to refresh their minds and spirits, to connect with something larger than their individual concerns. The communal aspect of the bathing created bonds between people that strengthened the social fabric of the entire city. As Keshen spent more time in contemplation at the Great Bath, he began to understand more deeply how water had shaped every aspect of Indus Valley urban planning. The location of cities along rivers, the design of drainage systems, the provision of wells and reservoirs, the creation of bathing facilities, all of these reflected a civilization that understood water as the foundation of life and organized itself accordingly. This relationship with water also explained the longevity and stability of Indus Valley cities. By working with natural water systems rather than against them, by designing urban infrastructure that enhanced rather than disrupted natural drainage patterns, the planners had created settlements that could adapt to variations in climate and river behavior. The cities had survived floods and droughts because they had been designed to accommodate the full range of natural conditions rather than to resist them. The apprentice's journey. During his final years, Keshen took particular pleasure in working with Varun, a young man who had shown exceptional aptitude for urban planning and who would eventually take over many of Keshen's responsibilities. Varun represented the next generation of planners, and in teaching him, Keshen was participating in the ancient process of knowledge transmission that had maintained the continuity of Indus Valley civilization for centuries. The education of an urban planner in Harappa was not a matter of formal instruction but of gradual immersion in a community of practice. Varun had begun his apprenticeship by performing simple tasks, cleaning tools, organizing clay tablets, mixing materials for brick-making. But even these basic activities were conducted with attention to the larger principles that governed all planning work. As Varun progressed in his training, he was gradually introduced to more complex responsibilities. He learned to take measurements, to record observations, to interpret the symbols and notations that were used to document planning decisions. But more importantly, he learned to see the city as a living system, to understand the relationships between different components of the urban infrastructure, to appreciate the human impact of design decisions. Keshen's teaching method emphasized observation over instruction. Rather than explaining principles abstractly, he would take Varun on long walks through the city, pointing out features that illustrated important concepts. A drainage channel that had been designed to handle varying water flows would become a lesson in engineering adaptability. A neighborhood where houses and workshops were integrated would demonstrate the value of mixed-use development. A public space that encouraged social interaction would show how design could strengthen community bonds. These walks were conducted at a pace that allowed for careful observation and reflection. Keshen had learned that understanding came not from quick exposure to many examples but from deep engagement with a few carefully chosen cases. Varun would spend weeks studying a single intersection, learning to see all the factors that had influenced its design and all the ways it affected the daily lives of the people who used it. The most important aspect of Varun's education was learning to think in terms of long-time scales. Modern urban planners often work under pressure to produce quick solutions to immediate problems. But in the Indus Valley, planning decisions were made with the understanding that their consequences would play out over generations. This required a different kind of thinking, one that emphasized careful analysis over rapid response, gradual refinement over dramatic change. Varun struggled at first with this long-term perspective. Like most young people, he was eager to make his mark, to implement innovations that would be recognized as his contributions. But Keshen taught him that the highest achievement in urban planning was not individual recognition but collective success. The best planner was one whose work was so well integrated with existing systems that it seemed natural and inevitable. As Varun matured in his understanding, he began to appreciate the profound satisfaction that came from this approach to work. Instead of competing with colleagues or seeking personal advancement, he could focus entirely on the intrinsic rewards of doing good work, the pleasure of solving complex problems, the satisfaction of seeing communities thrive, the peace that came from knowing that his efforts were contributing to something larger and more enduring than individual achievement. By the time Keshen was ready to step back completely from active practice, Varun had developed the knowledge, skills, and perspective necessary to carry on the tradition. He had learned not just the technical aspects of urban planning but the deeper wisdom that guided all decision-making. He understood that cities were not collections of buildings but ecosystems that supported human flourishing. He knew that the purpose of planning was not to impose order on chaos but to create conditions where natural patterns of human behavior could unfold in healthy and productive ways. The evening of a lifetime. On his last day as an active urban planner, Keshen performed one final ritual. He climbed to the roof of his workshop just as the sun was beginning to set, carrying with him a clay tablet on which he had inscribed his final observations about the city of Harappa. This tablet would be added to the archives that documented the entire history of the city's development, becoming part of the accumulated wisdom that would guide future generations of planners. The view from the rooftop was the same as it had been on thousands of previous evenings, yet it seemed transformed by the knowledge that this was his last time to see it as a practitioner, rather than as a retired elder. The geometric perfection of the street grid, the harmonious proportions of the buildings, the gentle flow of smoke from evening cooking fires, the distant sound of children playing in courtyards, all of these familiar elements combined to create a scene of profound peace and satisfaction. As darkness fell and the first stars appeared in the clear sky above the valley, Keshen found himself thinking about the nature of the work he had devoted his life to. Urban planning, as practiced in the Indus Valley, was not primarily a technical discipline but a form of applied wisdom. It required not just knowledge of engineering and architecture but deep understanding of human nature, social dynamics, and environmental systems. The planners who had created Harappa and the other great cities of the Indus Valley had been motivated by a vision of human possibility. They had believed that it was possible to create environments where people could live in peace and prosperity, where communities could thrive over long periods of time, where the relationship between human society and the natural world could be one of harmony rather than conflict. This vision had guided every decision, from the largest questions of city layout to the smallest details of house design. The result was a form of urban civilization that had achieved something unprecedented in human history, the creation of large, complex settlements that were both highly sophisticated and deeply humane. The knowledge that he had been part of this achievement filled Keshen with a quiet satisfaction that had nothing to do with personal pride or individual accomplishment. He had been privileged to participate in a collective endeavor that was larger than any single lifetime, to contribute his small part to something that would benefit countless people he would never meet. As he prepared to leave the rooftop for the last time, Keshen looked out once more over the city. That had been his life's work. In the gentle darkness, with the stars wheeling overhead and the sound of flowing water murmuring beneath the streets, Harappa seemed to embody everything that was best about human civilization: the application of intelligence to create beauty, the organization of community to support individual flourishing, the patient accumulation of wisdom to benefit future generations. The clay tablet in his hands contained his final gift to those who would come after him. Observations about how the city worked, suggestions for improvements that might be made, insights about the relationship between physical space and human well-being that had taken a lifetime to develop. These words would join the thousands of other tablets in the city's archives, becoming part of the living memory that guided ongoing development. As Keshen descended from the rooftop and walked through the quiet streets toward his home, he carried with him the deep peace that comes from a life well lived in service to something greater than oneself. The drainage channels beneath his feet carried away the day's waste water with their usual efficiency. The wells in every neighborhood provided clean water for evening cooking and washing. The carefully planned proportions of streets and buildings created a sense of order and beauty that would welcome residents home from their daily work. These systems would continue to function long after Keshen was gone, serving families and communities with the same quiet reliability that had characterized them for centuries. New generations of planners would maintain and improve them, guided by the accumulated wisdom of their predecessors and motivated by the same vision of human possibility that had inspired the original builders. This continuity was perhaps the greatest achievement of Indus Valley civilization, the creation of systems and traditions that could support human flourishing across the centuries. It was a legacy built not by individual genius but by collective wisdom, not through dramatic innovation, but through patient refinement, not for temporary advantage but for enduring benefit. The dreams of stone. The cities of the Indus Valley continued to thrive for several more centuries after Keshen's retirement, adapting gradually to changing conditions while maintaining the essential principles that had made them successful. The urban systems that he and his colleagues had developed proved remarkably resilient, continuing to support large populations through periods of climatic variation and social change. But eventually, like all human institutions, the Indus Valley civilization came to an end. The cities were gradually abandoned as rivers changed course, trade networks shifted, and populations moved to new areas. The careful engineering was slowly covered by accumulating earth and vegetation, until nothing remained visible of the remarkable urban achievements. For nearly 4,000 years, the cities lay buried and forgotten. The knowledge of how to create such sophisticated urban systems was lost. Civilizations rose and fell without achieving the same level of integration between technical capability and human wisdom that had characterized Harappa and its sister cities. When archaeologists finally rediscovered the Indus Valley sites in the early 20th century, they were astonished by what they found. The level of urban planning was far in advance of what they had expected from such an ancient civilization. The sophisticated drainage systems, the standardized construction materials, the careful attention to public health and environmental quality represented achievements that would not be equaled in many parts of the world until the modern era. But perhaps the most remarkable discovery was the evidence of how long these systems had functioned successfully. Layer upon layer of occupation showed that the cities had been continuously inhabited for centuries, with the same urban plans and building standards maintained throughout. This was not the product of a single brilliant generation but of a sustained tradition of excellence that had been passed down from teachers to students over many generations. The archaeologists found no evidence of palaces or temples, no obvious signs of extreme wealth or poverty, no weapons of war or monuments to individual rulers. Instead, they found the remains of what appeared to be an egalitarian society focused on creating comfortable, healthy living conditions for all its members. The cities had been built not to glorify kings or gods but to serve the needs of ordinary families and working people. Modern urban planners studying the Indus Valley sites have been struck by how many of the solutions developed 4,000 years ago remain relevant to contemporary challenges. The integration of residential and commercial areas, the emphasis on public health infrastructure, the creation of community spaces that strengthen social bonds, the design of cities that work with rather than against natural systems, all of these remain important goals for planners working in the 21st century. But perhaps the most important lesson from the Indus Valley civilization is not about any specific planning technique but about the attitude toward urban development that made their achievements possible. The planners who created Harappa and its sister cities approached their work with a combination of technical competence and philosophical wisdom that is rare in any era. They understood that the purpose of cities is not merely to accommodate large numbers of people but to create conditions where human potential can flourish. This understanding required them to think not just about immediate practical needs but about the deeper patterns of human behavior and social organization. They had to consider not just the physical requirements of urban life but the psychological and spiritual needs of urban residents. They had to balance individual privacy with community connection, economic efficiency with environmental sustainability, innovation with tradition. The result was a form of urban civilization that achieved something unprecedented: the creation of large, complex cities that remained livable, sustainable, and humane over many centuries. This achievement represents one of humanity's greatest experiments in social organization, and its lessons remain relevant for anyone concerned with creating better cities and better communities. As we face our own challenges of urbanization, climate change, and social sustainability, the example of the Indus Valley civilization offers both inspiration and practical guidance. It shows that it is possible to create urban environments that serve human needs while respecting natural systems. It demonstrates that technical sophistication and human wisdom can be successfully integrated. Most importantly, it proves that ordinary people, working together with patience and dedication, can create extraordinary things that endure for centuries. The clay tablets that recorded Keshan's observations have long since crumbled to dust, but the principles they embodied live on in every thoughtfully planned neighborhood, every well-designed public space, every urban system that puts human well-being at the center of its design. The work continues, carried forward by new generations of planners and builders. guided by the same vision of human possibility that inspired the creation of the world's first great cities in the fertile valley where two rivers met beneath an endless sky. And now, as the stars trace their ancient paths above us, as the cycle of day and night continues its eternal rhythm, as rivers flow toward distant seas carrying the dreams and hopes of countless generations, let your own thoughts drift back through time to that peaceful valley. Let your mind rest in the quiet satisfaction of work well done, of systems functioning smoothly, of communities thriving in harmony with the natural world. Feel the smooth warmth of sun-dried bricks beneath your feet, the gentle murmur of clean water flowing through hidden channels, the soft voices of families settling into the peace of evening. Know that somewhere in the accumulated wisdom of human experience, the patient knowledge of builders and planners continues to serve the dream of cities that nurture rather than exhaust, that heal rather than harm, that connect rather than divide. Sleep now in the embrace of that ancient wisdom, carried by the rhythm of flowing water, sheltered by walls built to last for generations, surrounded by the quiet presence of communities that understood the true purpose of human settlement, not dominion over the earth, but partnership with it, not the glorification of power, but the patient cultivation of peace. Let your dreams be filled with straight streets that lead to beautiful destinations, with clear water flowing exactly where it should flow, with the satisfaction that comes from contributing to something larger and more enduring than any single lifetime. Rest now in the knowledge that the work of creating better communities continues, guided by the timeless wisdom that beauty and function can be one, that individual and community can flourish together, that human intelligence applied with patience and care can create wonders that endure long after their creators have been forgotten. And in your sleep, may you find the peace that Keshen found in his evening contemplations, the deep contentment that comes from knowing that your small part in the great work of human civilization has been performed with love, with skill, with dedication to the flourishing of generations yet to come.